This is the 5-minute podcast review for Tuesday, September 11, 2018. It's the podcast about podcasts where each episode I take a quick look at a few new podcasts you might want to check out. Often they're literally new podcasts, sometimes they're podcasts that have been around a while, but you or I may not have yet discovered them. The aim isn't to go into great detail or give lengthy reviews on the podcasts I talk about. Instead, I take more of what I like to think of as the dinner table or word of mouth approach. That is, just telling you about a few interesting podcasts each episode in the way that you might hear about them from a friend over the dinner table. Just enough information that you get the idea of what the podcast is about and to know that if it's for you or not, or at least if it's worth checking out further. It's just a minute or two on each podcast and it's all over in around 5 minutes, so easy to subscribe to with no great demand on your listening time. Not all podcasts will be for everyone, but I reckon sometimes it's interesting just to know that particular podcasts exist. The variety and subject matter of podcasts out there these days is vast and expanding every day. The first podcast, Future Martians, is a good example of this expanding diversity. Now, you may or may not have heard of the Mars One project, which aims to establish a permanent human settlement on Mars. And unlike NASA or SpaceX, who are also interested in Mars, the Mars One project has an interesting plan to cut the cost of getting people to Mars, and that plan is to leave them there. It's a one-way trip. The Future Martians podcast is hosted by two of the current 100 astronaut candidates for the Mars One project, a number that will eventually be whittled down to 24. Across the 12 episodes of Future Martians, the hosts Diane McGrath and Josh Richards interview a cross-section of their fellow candidates for this one-way trip to Mars, essentially asking the questions, why would you want to make this trip and what do you plan to do with your remaining time on Earth? Now, it has to be said there's a huge amount of skepticism around the Mars One project, and you can read all about that online. And definitely the Mars One project has some massive challenges, having raised only around $1 million since 2011 of the supposed $6 billion, some say more, that would be required to pull off the mission. But for the 100 candidates, the prospect that they'll one day leave Earth for a one-way trip to Mars is real, and it makes for some interesting conversations. I found myself downloading one episode after the other for a binge listen, and with all 12 episodes up now, you can do the same. That's Future Martians, and you can check it out using the link I've put on your screen. Moving along to our second podcast, True North. Not quite sure why it's called True North, but it's a podcast series that focuses on design, and particularly user experience design, or UX design as it's called. These days, UX design often refers to the design of websites and apps, aiming to make them as intuitive and obvious to use as possible. But good user experience design applies, or at least should apply, to everything from physical products through to experiences like boarding a plane or being a patient in a hospital even. True North is broken into 2 seasons of episodes looking at various applications of user experience design, and between the 2 seasons is what they call a master series featuring extended interviews with world leaders in UX design, including even the director of UX at Google. User experience design is definitely a specialist field, but at the end of the day, we're all users on the receiving end of the designed experiences, and that's why I think the episodes of True North will be interesting to a much broader audience than just UX designers. True North's an easy listen, with most episodes running 18 to 20 minutes, except for the Master Series episodes, which are around an hour each. Okay, if True North sounds like it could be of interest to you, check it out, and again, you can use the link I've put on your screen. Time to quickly mention a third podcast, the Elephant in the Room Property Podcast. Hosted by Veronica Morgan, a buyer's agent, and Chris Bates, a financial planner and mortgage broker, the Elephant in the Room Property Podcast aims to lift the curtain on the world of real estate, with episodes talking to a number of high-profile estate agents, auctioneers, and buyers advocates. If you're in the market, either as a buyer or a seller, this is a great podcast to listen to. The hosts successfully get their professional real estate guests to spill their guts on the tricks and tactics used to extract your last dollar. And a lot of it comes down to consumer behavior psychology. That's where the title of the podcast, The Elephant in the Room, comes into it. The idea being that most of us, when it comes to making major decisions around buying, selling, or even renting property, most of us base too much of our decision-making on our hearts and not our heads. That emotion that we feel around property buying is what they call the elephant in the room. I've got to admit that's a fairly convoluted naming logic, and the podcast should probably be called something like just the Property Podcast, but it's called the Elephant in the Room Property Podcast, and it's fairly revealing and informative listening. I should probably mention also that it's an Australian-based podcast, and some of the terminology and advice given is Australian-specific, but in general, the real estate agent tips and tricks discussed are universal. Okay, that just about wraps it up for this episode with 3 interesting podcasts to check out: Future Martians, True North, the UX Design Podcast, and the Elephant in the Room Property Podcast. You'll find all 3 wherever you found this podcast, or as I said, just use the links on your screen. See you in the next episode, and thanks for listening.